Welcome to Nobody Told Me. I'm Jan Black.
And I'm Laura Owens.
It can be tough to be a teenager these days. Teenagers experience some complex issues, all of which may be caused by or contribute to depression and other mental illnesses. Bullying, anxiety, addiction, peer pressure, academic stress, and family issues can leave teenagers feeling lost and perhaps suicidal.
Our guest on this episode, certified grief recovery specialist Kristi Hugstad, has written a new book called Beneath the Surface to help teenagers reach out when they're in crisis or want to help a friend who's struggling. Kristi, thank you so much for joining us today. This is such an important topic.
Oh, I'm so happy to be here, and thank you so much for having me.
Tell us more about what led you to write Beneath the Surface.
Well, I had suicide touch my life personally. My husband completed suicide about 6 years ago by running in front of a train in Dana Point where we lived.
Oh, my gosh.
All the warning signs and risk factors of depression and suicide were there. I spent about a year before his suicide trying to get him help, taking him to different psychiatrists, psychologists, church counselors, basically trying to fix him. And looking back now, I can see he was the textbook case of somebody that had suicidal ideation. Those warning signs and risk factors were red flags waving right in front of me. Yet I didn't know them and I didn't recognize them. And more importantly, I didn't know what to do. So instead of just, focusing on helping him, I focused more on trying to fix him because I too bought into that stigma of mental illness. And I didn't want him to be sick. I wanted my old husband back the way he was when I first met him.
What's the difference between helping and fixing?
Well, fixing, I think, is a little more selfish. My motive for fixing him is I wanted him to be the same person that I married. And I wanted to go backwards. Helping him would be acknowledging that he has a disease, that he has a mental illness, and he may be struggling with that for the rest of his life, and he's going to need tools to be able to deal with that on an ongoing basis, and that requires help from professionals, whether or not, medications, whatever that might entail. So helping is an ongoing thing, where fixing him is like you fix a flat tire and then it's good to go.
How did the warning signs change from when he was just struggling with depression versus when he became suicidal?
They started to become more extreme examples of what he was first exhibiting. So, for example, he used to talk about suicide. Anything was an opportunity to take his life. We'd go for a walk on the bluff in Dana Point, and he'd say, let's jump. Everything, or, a garbage truck would go by and he'd say, I feel like jumping in front of that. I'd be in the kitchen cooking and he'd pick up a knife and, pretend to stab himself. But as his depression worsened, all of the symptoms and warning signs got worse and they became more frequent, and they several times a day. So there was always that constant negative talk of not wanting to be here.
Was there any particular event that sort of triggered this, that pushed him to be not the man you had married?
I don't think there was one big event. I think there was a host of things that happened. There was a major traumatic life event, which for me was exciting and an adventure. We moved to our vacation home in Rosarito, Mexico. And we had sold our gym, so, we were doing fine financially. But for him, that was isolation, and that was loss of identity. And he didn't know anybody, and his sense of security was compromised. So what was an exciting adventure for me, I think, was something that was really traumatic for him. Selling our gym was great. We got out right before the recession in 2008. And so I felt really blessed to, be able to make that sale. But for him, it was all he knew, and it was his identity. So I didn't realize that a lot of things were really positive for me were actually quite devastating for Bill.
So how can you tell if somebody is going through a time of change in their life? Are the outward warning signs always there to show whether it's a negative for them or a positive for them?
Well, everybody's different. And, not everybody exhibits all the warning signs or risk factors, but that doesn't matter. Just one or two of them is cause for concern. So, but for Bill, for example, he was very withdrawn. He didn't want to socialize. He felt very hopeless. Everything he talked about was very negative. The risk factors are there too. There is a genetic component to depression and suicidal ideation. He had two grandparents that had each had a suicide attempt. So there was depression in his family. I didn't realize the significance of that. So he exhibited so many of the warning signs, but that's not always the case. There are people that really are very secretive and very good, actors and actresses, and can do a really good job pretending that everything's okay.
Do you think when you were taking these walks and he would jokingly say, "Oh, let's jump," or when he'd pick up the knife in the kitchen and pretend to stab himself, do you think these were cries for help and you could have done something to prevent this, or do you think this was just not something that could have been prevented?
There was a point, in all honesty, where I became kind of hardened by it, and you get conditioned to it. And so I didn't take it seriously, because there was a time when I thought, are just being a spoiled only child that needs attention. So there were times when I thought he was just trying to get my attention. And now looking back, the fact that everything was an opportunity for suicide, that's not normal. And I do really think those were cries for help. But you know what? He was a middle-aged white man, which is the biggest risk group for suicide, right? And he had already bought into the stigma of mental illness. And to ask for help and to reach out, I think in Bill's mind was a sign of weakness. So instead of just coming right out and saying, "Hey, Kristi, there's something wrong, I'm not okay, and I need help," that is something I don't think you would have ever done. So his way of reaching out was, I'm going to jump in front of that garbage truck, or I'm going to jump off the bluff, or will you come with me? We can do this together. And at the time, I didn't realize that talk of suicide constantly, in his case, were real warning signs of what he was planning.
I'm curious to know, in his case and in most cases, is suicide usually well thought out, or is it an impulsive choice? It can be either. It can be impulsive, just because of a tragic life event or a trauma, and that's why. Or it can be well thought out. And in Bill's case, I think it was well thought out, and he had a prior attempt. And I think part of it is he knew I was trying so hard to fix it that I think he just kind of went along with it for a while. But he had searched for methods online, everything from cyanide poisoning. He was constantly checking the train schedules, which I found out later when I did a search. So this is something that he had planned to do. I don't think he had the actual day and time. I thought he had a plan. He was waiting till he was pushed to the point where he no longer could take it. But a lot of times it's an impulsive act. And that's what scares me about teens, is their brains are not fully developed and they don't have good impulse control. So, for teens, until they're about age 25, without that fully developed brain, which means I'm talking specifically about the prefrontal cortex, that's the front part of your brain that's responsible for the decision-making and the rational behavior. If that's not developed and they feel like they have no out and they have a major traumatic life event,
that can be a possibility that they would want to end their life. So I think it's especially important to watch teens and the impulsivity of suicide because, they don't have the brain power to think rationally.
What are some of the warning signs that might indicate a teenager is struggling and perhaps suicidal?
Well, I like to kind of simplify it and make a statement that your child or your loved one starts to become someone you no longer know. So in other words, they have changes in behavior. They might start hanging out with different people. They might change their appearance. They don't sleep. They don't eat, or they sleep all the time, or they eat all the time. So changes in sleeping patterns and eating patterns. The hopelessness. They no longer are interested in activities that they once enjoyed. They're isolating. They're withdrawing. They're just not engaging in life. Skipping school, declining grades, not taking care of their hygiene, not showering, just not caring.
Picture your face in the mirror. Do you see all those wrinkles around your eyes? How about crow's feet or those large under-eye bags?
Now imagine they're gone. We're not talking about some risky, expensive surgery, just gone in minutes. It's called Plexiderm, a clinically studied serum that visibly eliminates your wrinkles, crow's feet, and under-eye bags in minutes. It's the edge you've been looking for.
Don't believe it? I didn't either until I tried it. Now I don't have to imagine anymore. I look like me, just 10 years younger. Simply put, I'm blown away by the results.
Plexiderm can give you the confidence you'll need to be yourself at work or out with friends. The best part is Plexiderm goes on clear so nobody will know you're using it unless you tell them.
Go to tryplexiderm.com and use our code, Nobody Told Me, for 50% off, plus an additional $10 off. That's right, 50% off plus an extra $10 off. This offer is available by calling 1-800-685-1292 and mentioning code, Nobody Told Me.
Plexiderm is backed by a 30-day money-back guarantee. Visit tryplexiderm.com today and use code NOBODYTOLDME at checkout. That's tryplexiderm.com and use code NOBODYTOLDME at checkout. How should teenagers approach a friend if they're concerned about them? Should they go directly to that friend or should they go through a parent or a counselor first?
Well, the best advice I can give a teen that has a peer that's struggling is you, first and foremost, even if they've sworn you to secrecy and said, hey, I've thought about suicide and please don't tell anybody, that's not the time to keep a secret. You immediately need to tell an adult that you trust, whether that's a teacher, their parent, your parent, somebody from the church, a counselor, an administrator. But teens cannot take this into their own hands and try to fix them, because this is a life or death situation. But certainly they need to be compassionate, to reach out and say, I'm here for you, let's talk, and just kind of be a heart with ear. So it's important that they're compassionate and they let their peer know that they're there for them, they're with no judgment, and at the same time, reach out to an adult you trust.
And what advice do you have then for parents who suspect that their teenager might be suicidal or going through some kind of a crisis that they don't really know about?
Well, first of all, their parents need to keep the lines of communication open with their kids. They need to set those ground rules when they're really young and let them know that whatever they're dealing with, whatever they're struggling with, whether it's emotional or physical, we need to talk. So the first thing is to have those open lines of communication so that their child does not feel like their parents are going to be disappointed in them, like they're letting their parents down. And I know for parents it's difficult to ask questions about their child's emotional health. So that's why in the back of Beneath the Surface, I wrote discussion questions for every type of issue there is, whether it's cyberbullying or self-harm, substance abuse, technology addiction. Here are questions to help you start those conversations with your kids. And that way, instead of when they come home from school, say, well, how was school? And typically the answer you're going to get is, well, it's fine. Say, you can actually ask about their peers, well, how's John doing? You said that he was being kind of quiet lately. Is everything okay with him? Or talk to them about their friends' emotional health and just try to get them on the same page with you that their emotional health needs to be discussed on a daily basis as well. And they also need, if you feel like it's not just a passing, phase of something that's going on in school that will, stop being a big stressor in a few days, get them to see a therapist and a counselor so that these kids have an opportunity to process what they're going through.
It wasn't all that long ago that I was a teenager myself, and since then I've been diagnosed with depression, and I have a bunch of friends who also have struggled with emotional issues. And one thing we've all talked about is that there was no way our counselors or anybody at school could have detected that we had any emotional issues. So I'm wondering if you can think of any good ways for schools to screen for teenage depression and find out if their students might be at risk for suicidal behaviors or simply mental health issues.
Well, that's a really, really good question. And you know what? There are schools that do mental health evaluations, but there are questions that the kids are filling out. And, it's a hard topic for kids, too. They don't want to own but they still buy into the stigma of mental illness, so they don't answer honestly. And so
of course.
That's really hard. And the other difficult thing is that a lot of the school counselors, number one, there aren't enough. And a lot of them are also serving as academic counselors.
I was going to say the focus was all on college and grades.
Absolutely. Yeah. And there needs to be somebody that separately handles the academics and then somebody that handles the emotional welfare of the kids, or 5 or 6, depending on how many students in your school. So the schools are so understaffed. But what I'm thinking, too, is, kids go to school and they go get a physical, right? But during that physical, there should also be a mental health evaluation by a professional. That's outside of the school.
Yeah.
And that isn't happening. So that's why we all have to have our radars out. Anybody that has a loved one, a loved teen in their life, whether it's the parent, the aunt, the uncle, the teacher, the administrator, all of us need to be on the same page and have a radar to recognize when our teens need help, because they're usually not going to reach out themselves.
And so what can a teacher do, for example, if a teacher sees a kid or maybe a couple of them that are struggling and it seems like it's not just a normal teenage crisis or situation that they're dealing with? What can a teacher do?
Well, the teacher needs to take some time to talk to that person privately, talk to that child privately. They can set up appointments with the counselors at school and talk to their parents. And then a determination needs to be made to get them outside of school to get professional help. So, it starts with the adult that you trust, which, can be your teacher. Or if the teacher recognizes those signs too, they need to take action. Because what about the signs that aren't visible? What about, teens are really good at pretending. And, it's hard for them to reach out. So if a teacher recognizes a few signs and enough that's concerning, what else is going on at home or outside of your classroom that you're not seeing? So it's really important for the teachers and the counselors and the parents to have open lines of communication to discuss, the well-being of that child.
Let's say that a parent has decided to take the step to seek out professional help for their child, and a professional puts the child on antidepressants. You hear so many different things about teenagers being on antidepressants and how dangerous they can be. And I'm wondering what your thoughts are on that.
Well, I think our society is a little too quick to medicate our youth. I'm not saying that doesn't mean that there are cases where a child does need medication. but it is, whenever a young child, even in grade school, is having some behavioral problems or put on Ritalin or whatever, it's just an easy fix, and that needs to stop. Usually the medications for depression in our youth have some severe side effects, and one of those side effects can be suicidal ideation. So I'm not saying, it's never an accepted practice, but we need to stop using it as a quick fix.
One of the points you make is that talking about depressive or suicidal thoughts and feelings with the right person makes all the difference in the world. How do you know who the right person is, especially if you're a teenager who's struggling?
Well, you can't know. And that's why you have to first reach out to the adult that you do trust. And if you're not getting the right conversation, or if you're not getting the responses making you feel better, then you move on to another adult you trust. And what I mean by that is, say, for example, when I go into schools, my message to the teens is tell an adult you trust. And then after my presentation, there'll be a line out the door because I'm that adult they trust. I'm not their teacher. I'm not their parent. I'm just an adult that cares. Mm-hmm. But a lot of times somebody who doesn't really understand depression and teen issues will respond with comments like, well, you just have to suck it up and it's not going to last forever and be tough. And, so-and-so has it a lot worse than you do. And you have a great family. You have so much to be thankful for. I don't know what you have to be depressed about. So if you get that kind of brush-off response, even though you trust that adult, it's not helpful. Mm-hmm. So then you move on, to somebody else and hopefully get a response of love and concern and caring and somebody that, wants to get you help.
You mentioned that research has shown that today's teens are more stressed than adults. And I'm wondering why these rates are just skyrocketing versus generations before.
Well, I know for me, when I was a teenager, when I got home from school, I had a safe place, and that was at home. Mm-hmm. If I was being bullied at school or anything that was going on that was stressful at school, at least when I got home, I had a safe place.
Mm-hmm. Right.
We didn't have cell phones. And sounds like I'm 100 years old here, but if somebody wanted to continue to bully me, they had to call my house. They're not going to get me. They're probably going to get one of my parents, and that takes a little bit of the fun out of the equation.
Yeah.
But kids now, if they're being bullied at school or they're not popular and they're having a hard time, when they get home, that's when the cyberbullying actually picks up. And that's when the other kids are home, and, that's when all the cyberbullying starts to happen. And so they don't have that safe place. And that's really tough. So I think the reason kids are experiencing so much mental illness is because of technology. They're mm-hmm. getting addicted to technology. It's the like generation. It's how, everybody's posting pictures on Snapchat and Instagram and Facebook about how perfect they look and how perfect their lives are. And for kids that are struggling, that can be very, very depressing. So there's a lot of comparison that goes on in social media, and it makes those kids feel really, really badly about themselves. And so I just have to say, it's technology. It's all the social media, and the depression isn't helped. And we see this all the time. You see, if you drive by a junior high at the end of the school day, everybody's looking down at their phone.
Of course.
They're not communicating. They're not socializing. Everybody is just engulfed in how many likes that last post I posted got.
Yeah. And since so many cases of teen suicide seem to have been preceded by bullying in some form or another, whether it's cyberbullying or not, what message would you like to get out about dealing with bullies? How can parents and teachers help a teen who's being bullied?
Well, it's really difficult because I remember being bullied in high school, and I didn't want my parents or teachers to get involved because I thought that bullying would get worse, which, that can happen as well.
Yeah.
But what kids don't understand, and again, because it's a lack of brain development at that age, that, sticks and stones may break my bones, but words actually can kill.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what's happening. So I don't know that kids have the brain power just to realize how devastating bullying actually is until it's brought up in the classrooms and it's discussed and everybody else gets on the same page so that all the other kids will stand up for that person that's being bullied. And it will be very taboo to be the person doing it. So I think an awareness needs to be brought about by the teachers and counselors and parents that, this is not going to be tolerated. And you will pay the consequences, whether you're going to be expelled for school or whatever. But, that is a big cause of teen suicide. Mm-hmm. And for kids to live with that the rest of their lives, that the bullying and the torment that I placed on my peer cost them their lives, they're not thinking that way. So I think that it needs to be addressed in the classroom, at school, as well as at home.
So many seemingly trivial things can cause a teenager to feel like there is no hope and that it's the end of the world for them. What advice do you have for teenagers to develop hope if they're feeling hopeless?
Well, I think what they have to realize first and foremost is that when they're feeling really hopeless, it's the depression talking. And depression is an illness, and it's a disease that has treatment. So once you realize that depression and how you're feeling is lying to you, and your thoughts are not you, if you can separate yourself from that, you can actually realize that there is hope. Things will change. It's going to take time. It may happen in small steps. But first you have to separate yourself from the disease and the depression to the future. And that's really tough for kids to do. And that's why adults need to step in and let our kids know that this is temporary, there is hope, but first you have to realize that the depression is lying to you, and those thoughts that there's no escape are not true. Because when people take their lives, when people die by suicide, it's not really that they so much that they want to die or that they want to hurt somebody. It's that they don't feel like there's any other way to end the pain. So that's why we need to give our kids hope that this is going to change, and you are not your thoughts, and you are not your mood.
So what message would you want to get across to someone who is listening right now, maybe a teenager, maybe an adult, who's feeling suicidal and really doesn't know where to turn? What's the message from you?
Well, speaking from experience, I can say that my husband's suicide basically turned my life upside down, and it's so devastating for the people that out there that love you. And I know when you're in that mindset, that's not what you're thinking of. You probably think, like my husband did, that you're a burden and that all your loved ones would be better off without you. That is such a horrific lie. There are people out there that love you. You need to know that you matter. You need to know that you're not alone in this. And there is help and there is hope. So give yourself a chance at life and reach out to somebody that you trust and get help.
What do you think needs to be done to eliminate the stigma surrounding mental health?
Well, that's another reason why I wrote Beneath the Surface, is that we need to start these conversations at a young age. My husband had already bought into the stigma for years. But maybe if he was in the 9th grade and he was sitting in the class and I came to the classroom and talked about all these issues, what to do, here are the warning signs, where to go, and a message of hope, you might have thought, oh, man, wow, she's speaking to me. Mm-hmm. So we need to start these conversations young So this generation and all the generations to come grow up with mental health issues being a normal part of life instead of something to be ashamed of and not to speak of. And so to change that culture, we need to start with our youth. And that is my entire purpose of writing the book.
What misconceptions would you like to dispel about teen suicide or suicide in general?
That it's selfish. That's the big one. So many people said to me after Bill's death, I can't believe that he did that. He was an only child. His father was on the train he ran in front of. His parents, never really recovered. They just gave up on life. So many people said to me, that was so selfish of Bill to do that to you and his parents. Mm-hmm. And the myth I want to dispel is suicide is not a selfish act. They are not deliberately trying to hurt you. They actually think that they're a burden and that you would be better off without them and nobody will miss them. So their self-esteem is so low that the last thing they're thinking about is what kind of effect their death is going to have on you or their loved ones. So suicide is not selfish. It's not always about dying. It's about ending the pain that they have been dealing with, and for some people for a long time.
And Kristi, as you know, our show is called Nobody Told Me. And so at the end of each show, we ask our guests, what is your Nobody Told Me lesson? So what did nobody tell you about depression or suicide that you wish that they had before you lost your husband?
Nobody told me that it could happen to me. Nobody told me that I was not immune to suicide and depression. And it's one of those things where, these kind of tragedies happen to other people. And nobody told me that the grief of suicide, of, grieving a loved one by suicide would be so painful and so dark. Yeah.
Kristi, how can people connect with you on social media and the internet?
My website is thegriefgirl.com, and all my blogs and articles that I've written. If you want me to come to your school and speak to your students, there's a form to fill out. So the best way, all my information is on my website at thegriefgirl.com.
Wow. Well, Kristi, we thank you so much for joining us. This has really been enlightening, and I certainly think that we have helped some folks.
Well, thank you so much for having me.
Our thanks to our guest, Kristi Hugstad. Again, her book is called Beneath the Surface, A Teen's Guide to Reaching Out When You or Your Friend is in Crisis. Her website is thegriefgirl.com. I'm Jan Black.
And I'm Laura Owens.
You're listening to Nobody Told Me. Thank you so much for joining us.